It's happy Monday. Here I am back with my chalkboard. So the words from last time I wrote were ordeal, pummeled, and ferocity in chapter 7. And all those words were in the part where the storm came and said, so he was down under the sea for 297 days, which is almost a whole entire year, because a year is 365. On the 297th day of Edward's ordeal, a storm came. So an ordeal, you can tell from the sentence, is like something really difficult, something that is really hard to put up with. An ordeal is something like we're going through right now, the ordeal for me of learning how to do stuff on the internet, the ordeal of you guys having to stay inside, whatever. The storm was so powerful, it lifted him off the ocean floor and led him in a wild, crazy, and spinning dance. The water pummeled him. So pummeled is when the water is like punching him or moving him around. It's like if you ever went in the ocean, you would see the waves are very strong. So the water pummeled him, lifted him up, and shoved him back down. Help, thought Edward. The storm and here's the word, look at the word, ferocity. So you can see it comes from, it's like ferocious. It has the same root as ferocious, which means really like savage, or like a tiger could be described as being ferocious. So ferocity, the storm in its ferocity, it has the quality of being ferocious. It's very strong, very fierce. And then in the other chapter, all I wrote was the phrase, this is when the fisherman brought Edward home, and I wrote the phrase, Edward looked at this small town blanketed in dust. So it has the word blanket, like your blanket that you use on your bed, but instead of being blanketed by a blanket, dusk is when the sun is going down, and so the town was getting dark. So it's like a poetic way of saying the town was getting dark. And then there was that big reveal that Nellie, the fisherman's wife, would love to dress up Edward as a girl. So here he is. Chapter 9. And so Edward Tulane became Susanna. Nellie sewed several outfits for him, a pink dress with ruffles for special occasions, a simple shift fashioned out of a flower-covered cloth for everyday use, and a long white gown made of cotton for Edward to sleep in. In addition, she remade his ears, stripping them of the few pieces of fur that remained and designing him a new pair. "Oh," she told him when she was done, "you look lovely." He was horrified at first. He was, after all, a boy rabbit. He did not want to be dressed as a girl, and the outfits, even the special occasion dress, were so simple and so plain, they lacked the elegance and artistry of his real clothes. But then Edward remembered, lying on the ocean floor, the muck in his face, the stars so far away, and he said to himself, "What difference does it make, really? Wearing a dress won't hurt me." Besides, life in the little greenhouse with the fisherman and his wife was sweet. Nellie loved to bake, so she spent her entire day in the kitchen. She put Edward on the counter and leaned him up against the flour canister and arranged his dress around his knees. She bent his ears so that he could hear well. And then she set to work, kneading dough for bread and rolling out dough for cookies and pies. The kitchen soon filled with the smell of baking bread and with the sweet smells of cinnamon and sugar and cloves. The windows steamed up, and while Nellie worked, she talked. She told Edward about her children, her daughter Lolly, who was a secretary, and her boys, Ralph, who was in the army, and Raymond, who had died of pneumonia when he was only 5 years old. "He drowned inside of himself," said Nellie. "It was a horrible, terrible thing, the worst thing, to watch somebody you love die right in front of you and not be able to do nothing about it. I dream about him most nights." Nellie wiped at her tears with the back of her hands. She smiled at Edward. "I suppose you think I'm daft talking to a toy, but it seems to me that you are listening, Susanna." And Edward was surprised to discover that he was listening. Before, when Abilene talked to him, everything had seemed so boring and so pointless. But now the stories Nellie told struck him as the most important things in the world, and he listened as if his life depended on what she said. It made him wonder if some of the muck from the ocean floor had gotten inside his china head and damaged him somehow. In the evening, Lawrence came home from the sea and there was dinner, and Edward sat at the table with the fisherman and his wife. He sat in an old wooden high chair, and while at first he was mortified, remember that word? He was embarrassed, because a high chair, after all, was a chair designed for babies, not for elegant rabbits. He soon became used to it. He liked being up high, looking out over the table instead of staring at the tablecloth as he did at the Tulane household. He liked feeling part of things. Every night after dinner, Lawrence said that he thought he would go out and get some fresh air, and that maybe Susanna would like to come with him. He placed Edward on his shoulder as he had that first night when he walked him through town, bringing him home to Nellie. They went outside, and Lawrence lit his pipe and held Edward there on his shoulder. And if the night was clear, Lawrence said the names of the constellations, one at a time. Andromeda, Pegasus, pointing at them with the stem of his pipe. Edward loved looking up at the stars, and he loved the sounds of the constellation names. They were sweet in his ears. Sometimes, though, staring up at the night sky, Edward remembered Pellegrina, saw again her dark and glowing eyes, and a chill would go through him. Warthogs, he would think, witches. But Nellie, before she put him to bed every night, sang Edward a lullaby, a song about a mockingbird that did not sing and a diamond ring that would not shine, and the sound of Nellie's voice soothed the rabbit, and he forgot about Pellegrina. Life, for a very long time, was sweet. And then Lawrence and Nellie's daughter came for a visit. End of chapter 9. So a little cliffhanger. Here is his high chair. Think in your mind, make a prediction. It says life was sweet and then the daughter came for a visit. So think and we'll see right now. Lolly, chapter 10. Lolly was a lumpy woman who spoke too loudly and wore too much lipstick. She entered the house and immediately spotted Edward sitting on the living room couch. "What's this?" she said. She put down her suitcase and picked Edward up by one foot. She held him upside down. "That's Susanna," said Nellie. "Susanna?" shouted Lolly. She gave Edward a shake. His dress was up over his head and he could see nothing. Already he had formed a deep and abiding hatred for Lolly. "Your father found her," said Nellie. "She came up in a net and she didn't have no clothes on her, so I made her some dresses." "Ah! Have you gone skivvy?" shouted Lolly. "Rabbits don't need clothes." "Well," said Nellie. Her voice shook. "This one seemed to." Lolly tossed Edward back on the couch. He landed face down with his arms over his head and his dress still over his face, and he stayed that way through dinner. "Why have you got out that old high chair?" shouted Lolly. "Oh, don't pay it no mind," said Nellie. "Your father was just gluing on a missing piece. Wasn't you, Lawrence?" "That's right," said Lawrence without looking up from his plate. Of course, after dinner, Edward did not go outside and stand beneath the stars to have a smoke with Lawrence, and Nellie, for the first time since Edward had been with her, did not sing him a lullaby. In fact, Edward was ignored and forgotten about until the next morning, when Lolly picked him up again and pulled his dress down away from his face and stared him in the eye. "Got the old folks bewitched, don't you?" said Lolly. "I heard the talk in town, that they've been treating you like a rabbit child." Edward stared back at Lolly. Her lipstick was a bright and bloody red. He felt a cold breeze blow through the room. Was a door open somewhere? "Well, you don't fool me," she said. She gave him a shake. "We'll be taking a trip together, you and me." Holding Edward by the ears, Lolly marched into the kitchen and shoved him face down in the garbage can. "Ma!" Lolly shouted. "I'm taking the truck. I'm going to head on out and do some errands." "Oh," came Nellie's tremulous voice. "That's wonderful, dear. Goodbye, then." Goodbye, thought Edward as Lolly hauled the garbage can out to the truck. Goodbye, Nellie called again, louder this time. Edward felt a sharp pain somewhere deep inside his china chest, and for the first time, his heart called out to him. It said 2 words, Nellie, Lawrence. And that's the end. That's the sad end of chapter 10. Here's a picture of, you see the tire? So that's Edward apparently lying in the garbage dump. So, yes, once again, we're going to have we're having a little meeting today, but please listen to the chapter, post your comments. We can maybe discuss a little bit today about yesterday or Friday's chapter. So think about themes again. Constellations are definitely a theme. We found out some names of constellations, Andromeda and Pegasus. If you want, you can look them up on any kind of search thing and find out how do those 2 constellations look like. There's also the Lolly character. She kind of reminds me of some of the characters in the Tale of Despero. There's always some kind of mean adult characters who, because Nellie and Lawrence seem like characters who they kind of enter into like a magic thing. They're kind, but also they have an imagination where they can find a rabbit and have affection for a rabbit even though they're adults. But Lolly, I think, is embarrassed because her parents are treating, or maybe she feels jealous, like she's displaced because they're treating him like their child. Kind of like in the Beverly book, remember